In the mid-12th century, the Mongols weren't just a group of fighters. They were the masters of the largest land empire in history. They controlled the trade routes from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Europe. It was a total system of power, strong, rich, and seemingly impossible to break. Yet, in just a few decades, this massive machine of control shattered into pieces. It didn't happen because of an outside invasion or a secret plot. It happened because the very rules that helped them conquer the world made it impossible for them to keep it. If you looked at the Mongol Empire in 1259, you would see a superpower at its peak. The government controlled the flow of silk, gold, and silver across the entire continent. They had an army that moved faster and hit harder than anything the world had ever seen. But they had a problem at the very top of their government. They relied on a single leader to hold everything together, but they had no clear rule for who that leader should be. When the Great Khan died, the entire system ground to a halt. His sons and grandsons turned their armies against each other. The money that had built their empire was soon being spent on civil wars. The trade routes that brought them wealth became battlefields for different Mongol princes. This is the story of how the world's most powerful force was dismantled by its own success. Before we look at the first crack in the empire, tell me in the comments, do you think any government today is too big to stay in one piece? To understand the collapse, you have to understand the rule of the Great Khan. The Mongols believed that only one man could sit at the top of the pyramid. This leader had absolute power over the army and all the money collected from trade. As long as the leader was strong and clear, the empire stayed in one piece. But the Mongols had a specific tradition that became their biggest weakness. They did not believe that the oldest son should automatically take over the government. Instead, all the royal family members had to meet and vote on a new leader. This meant that every time a leader died, the entire empire stopped moving for months or even years. Armies would leave the borders they were defending and march back to the center to fight for the throne. While the family argued over who should have the power, the local people they had conquered began to stop paying their taxes. The trade routes became unsafe because there were no soldiers left to guard them. The system of control was being pulled apart by the very people who were supposed to protect it. The Mongol princes stopped caring about the empire and started caring only about their own piece of the map. This was the succession trap. By trying to make sure they always had the strongest leader, they ensured they would eventually have a war every time a leader died. The Mongols were masters of movement, but they were not masters of counting money. To keep their power, they needed to keep the army happy with new riches. As long as they were winning wars, they could take gold and silver from defeated cities. But once the empire stopped growing, the government had to find new ways to pay for its massive force. They created a tax system that relied on local officials to collect money from farmers and merchants. The problem was that the empire was so big that the leaders in the center couldn't see what was happening on the edges. Local governors began to steal from the tax money before it ever reached the Great Khan. To hide this loss of money, the government in China began to print paper, currency. They told the people that this paper was just as good as silver, but they printed too much of it because they were desperate to pay their soldiers. The value of the money dropped so fast that merchants stopped accepting it for trade. This created a massive economic crash that made it impossible for the government to buy supplies. At the same time, the different Mongol princes began to charge their own taxes on the Silk Road. Instead of one single road with one set of rules, the trade route became a series of gates where every prince wanted a cut of the profit. The cost of moving goods became so high that trade slowed down to a crawl. The empire's biggest source of wealth was being choked by the greed of its own leaders. The army, which used to be the strongest force on earth, was now underpaid and poorly equipped. The Mongols were losing the one thing that made them different from the people they conquered, their efficiency. By trying to squeeze more money out of a broken system, they pushed the local people toward rebellion. By the late 1200s, the dream of a single Mongol government was dead. The empire split into 4 large regions, each ruled by a different branch of the family. These regions were known as Khanates. The leaders in China, Persia, Russia, and Central Asia stopped taking orders from the center. This division broke the unified military system that had made the Mongols unstoppable. Instead of fighting the rest of the world, the Mongol Khanates began fighting each other over border lines and trade profits. These internal wars were incredibly expensive and destroyed the very lands they were supposed to rule. Because the empire was no longer a single unit, the system of fast communication across Asia began to fail. The Yam system, which was a massive network of horse stations for messengers, fell apart in many areas. Without fast communication, the rulers could not move their armies in time to stop local revolts. The economic links that tied the east to the west were being cut by Mongol swords. As the different Khanates became more isolated, they stopped acting like Mongols and started acting like the people they had conquered. In China, the Mongol rulers adopted the rules of the local government to try and stay in power. In Persia, they changed their laws to match the local customs of the Middle East. This loss of a shared Mongol identity meant they no longer trusted each other. They began to see their fellow Mongol princes as bigger threats than the local rebels. The empire was no longer a solid wall of power. It was a group of separate states that were slowly losing their grip. By the time the next major crisis hit, the Mongols were too divided to stand together. The Mongols had built a system where they were the small group at the top, ruling over millions of local people. They stayed in power because they were better at war and better at moving resources than anyone else. But as the civil wars between the Khanates continued, the cost of keeping control became too high. In China, the Mongol-led government began to lose its grip on the local population. They had used heavy force to collect taxes, but now that the army was divided, the people no longer feared them. Large groups of rebels began to organize because the government could no longer protect them from floods or famine. Instead of spending money on fixing the irrigation systems for farms, the rulers spent it on weapons to fight other Mongols. Because the farms were failing, the tax money stopped coming in, and the government's power vanished. In the West, the Mongol rulers faced a different kind of pressure. The trade routes that brought wealth from China were being cut off by the fighting in Central Asia. Without the profit from the Silk Road, the Mongol leaders in Persia and Russia could not pay their local officials. These officials began to make their own deals with local lords and stopped, following orders from the Mongol center. The government's rules were being ignored in every corner of the empire. The Mongols had once been a single, sharp force, but now they were scattered and weak. They were no longer the masters of trade. They were just another group of rulers struggling to survive. By the mid-13th century, the local people in China and Persia launched massive wars to kick the Mongols out. The Mongols had the better technology and the better army on paper, but they had no money and no unity. One by one, the regions they had conquered for 100 years began to break away. The empire wasn't just losing territory, it was losing the ability to function as a state. The end of the Mongol Empire was not a single event, but a total breakdown of the system. By the late 1300s, the center could no longer hold the pieces together. In China, a massive rebellion finally pushed the Mongol rulers out of the capital. The Mongols were forced to retreat back to the north, losing their biggest source of wealth and tax money. In Persia and Central Asia, the Mongol states simply stopped existing as unified powers. They shattered into small local territories ruled by whoever had enough soldiers to take control. The Mongol rulers had made the mistake of trying to run half the world with rules meant for a small group of fighters. They relied on the strength of a single person at the top, but they had no way to stop that person's family from fighting each other. By the time the system broke, there was no Mongol army left that was strong enough to fix it. The trade routes that had once tied the world together were now dangerous and closed. The empire had become too expensive to defend and too complicated to manage. The Mongols had conquered everything, but in the process, they had destroyed the very things that made them powerful. They lost their unity, they lost their money, and finally, they lost their land. The story of the Mongols is a lesson in the limits of military force. You can take a country with an army, but you cannot keep it if you do not have a system of rules that survives the leader. The largest empire in history didn't fall because of a better army. It fell because the math of ruling it no longer worked. The pieces of the empire didn't just move to new owners. They became the modern nations we see on the map today.